Welcome. You've arrived here now at this moment of quiet. Let the day's weight fall away. Let your breathing slow, your body settle. There's no rush, no urgency, just this long, gentle story unfolding. Tonight we travel to the Great Plains of North America, a place of grass and sky stretched impossibly wide, a place where the wind never stopped, where it shaped everything, the land, the grass, the lives of those who called it home. The people there, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Crow, the Comanche, built homes from poles and hide, homes that could be packed and carried, following the buffalo herds across distances measured in weeks of travel. But these homes were also built to stand against winds that could destroy a modern house, winds that reached 100 miles per hour. Over the next while we'll move slowly through their world. We'll see how the tipis shape guided wind harmlessly past, how pegs driven deep into prairie sod held the structure fast, how families slept warm inside listening to the steady drum of wind on taut hide, a sound that meant safety, not danger. So breathe, settle in, and let this story carry you gently forward. Before we can understand the tipi, we must first understand the land that demanded it. The Great Plains stretch from the Rocky Mountains in the west to the Mississippi River in the east. This is not a small territory. It covers over 500,000 square miles, an inland sea of grass that rolls on, unbroken toward every horizon. For the people who lived here, the most defining feature was not a mountain range or a river valley. It was the sky. The sky dominated everything. It filled the view in all directions, pressing down on the land with its immense weight and presence. And from the sky came the wind. This wind was constant. It moved across the grasslands with nothing to slow it, nothing to block it. There were no thick forests, no significant hills on the open prairie. The land itself was flat or gently rolling, allowing the wind to travel uninterrupted for hundreds of miles. It was a wind that shaped the grass, bending it in waves like water, a wind that dried the air and pulled moisture from everything it touched. In winter, this wind brought blizzards. Arctic air would sweep down from the north, carrying ice and snow at speeds that turned the world white and blind. Temperatures would plummet far below zero. A person caught in such a storm without shelter could freeze in minutes. The wind chill alone could be lethal. In spring and summer, the wind fueled thunderstorms. Massive systems would build in the afternoon heat, towering columns of cloud that rose miles into the scatter. These storms brought torrential rain, lightning that split the darkness, and hail that could bruise skin and kill livestock. And with these storms came tornadoes, violent, twisting winds that carved paths of destruction across the prairie. Meteorologists today, studying historical weather patterns and modern storm data, confirm that straight-line winds on the plains could easily exceed 80 or 90 miles per hour during severe weather. In the most extreme storms, gusts reached 100 miles per hour or more. This is a force that destroys. In our modern world, winds of this strength peel roofs from houses. They topple trees, shatter windows, and tear apart structures built from wood and nails. A standard rectangular house presents a flat wall to the wind. The wind pushes against that wall with concentrated force. Either the wind must go around or the wall must fail. The people of the plains needed something different. They needed a home that could be dismantled in less than an hour, packed onto travois, and carried to a new location as the buffalo herds moved. But they also needed a home that could stand firm when the sky turned dark and the wind began to howl. A home that would not fight the wind, but would yield to it, shed its power, and remain standing when the storm had passed. They created the tipi. The genius of the tipi begins with its most obvious feature, its shape. It is a cone. This is not an accident of convenience. It is not simply the easiest form to create with available materials. It is a deliberate act of engineering, refined over generations of observation and adaptation. When a 100-mile-per-hour wind strikes a flat wall, the physics are straightforward. The wind exerts pressure across the entire surface. That pressure is focused and more concentrated, pushing inward with tremendous force. The wall must be strong enough to resist that pressure, or it will buckle and fail. The connection between the wall and the foundation must hold, or the structure will be lifted and torn apart. But when that same wind strikes a cone, the interaction changes completely. The wind meets a sloping surface. There is no flat plane to push against. The force of the wind is immediately deflected. It splits, flows around the curve and moves upward and over the structure. The pressure is distributed, divided, guided harmlessly past. This is the same principle that allows a ship's bow to cut through water or a bird's wing to slip through air. The shape itself determines how the force is managed. A cone, with its continuous slope from base to peak, presents the smallest possible profile to the wind from any direction. No matter where the wind comes from, it encounters only a sloping surface that guides it away. The tipi's profile is low. It sits close to the ground, rising perhaps 12 to 15 feet at its peak, depending on size. The sloping walls create such a small angle of attack that the wind simply slides over and past. It cannot gain purchase. It cannot apply the concentrated force that would topple a vertical wall. But the tipi was not always a perfect symmetrical cone. Experienced builders understood that the wind had a prevailing direction. On the Great Plains, the strongest winds came from the west, so the tipi was often constructed with a deliberate tilt. The back of the structure, the side that would face the westerly winds, was built steeper. The front, where the doorway was located, had a gentler slope. This asymmetry added stability. The steep back wall anchored the structure against the prevailing wind, while the gentler front slope allowed the wind to flow up and over with even less resistance. The builders knew which direction danger came from. They oriented their homes accordingly. The structure was also flexible. It was not rigid like a house frame of lumber. It was made from wood and hide, materials that had given. In a powerful gust, the entire structure would shift slightly. The poles would bend just a little. The hide cover would vibrate, absorbing the wind's energy. Then it would settle back into place. This flexibility was crucial. A rigid structure strains under pressure. The stress concentrates at joints and connection points until something snaps, but a flexible structure dissipates that stress through movement. It bends without breaking. The tipi breathed with the storm, yielding to the wind's power rather than resisting it, and in yielding it survived. Structure is only as strong as its foundation. For the tipi, the foundation was not concrete or stone. It was wood, carefully selected, carefully arranged, creating a framework that could flex and hold at the same time. The poles were lodgepole pines. These trees grew in the mountain forests west of the plains, tall and straight, with minimal taper. They were valued for their length and strength. A good lodgepole pine could reach 20 to 25 feet, perfect for the tipi's height requirements. The wood was strong but not brittle, capable of bearing weight without snapping under stress. These poles were carried across great distances. Tribes living on the open prairie, far from mountain forests, would travel to obtain them or trade for them with neighbouring groups. A family's poles were valuable possessions, maintained and reused for years. The poles themselves became part of the family's identity, carried from camp to camp, season after season. Building the tipi began with 3 or 4 of these poles. They were laid out on the ground, their thicker ends aligned. These poles were then lashed together near their tops with a strong cord or rawhide. The lashing had to be tight, secure, and create a fixed point where all 3 or 4 poles met. Once lashed, the poles were lifted upright. This took coordination and strength. As they rose, they naturally spread apart at their bases, forming a tripod. This tripod was the structural heart of the tipi. It stood on its own, stable and balanced, with its legs splayed wide. The tripod's geometry provided inherent stability. 3 points define a plane. A tripod cannot wobble or tip unless one of its legs is lifted or broken. This basic stability formed the core that everything else would build upon. The remaining poles, anywhere from 12 to 20 additional pieces, were then added one by one. Each pole was lifted and laid into the notch where the tripod poles met at the top. The top end rested in this junction, while the bottom end was positioned on the ground, spreading outward to form the circular footprint of the tipi. As more poles were added, the circle expanded. The poles were spaced evenly around the perimeter, creating a framework that began to suggest the cone shape. Each pole added strength. Each one shared the load. The combined weight of all the poles pressed downward and inward, locking the structure together through compression and balance. The diameter of this circle varied depending on the size of the tipi. A small hunting shelter might be 10 feet across. A family lodge could reach 15 feet. Larger communal structures, used for gatherings or ceremonies, could exceed 20 feet in diameter. The number of poles increased with the size, maintaining structural integrity as the span grew wider. The bases of the poles were not anchored into the ground. They simply rested on the surface, held in place by their own weight and the tension of the structure. This allowed the tipi to be erected on any terrain, frozen ground, rocky soil, dense prairie. No digging was required. The structure was entirely self-supporting through geometry and balance. The centre of gravity was very low. The wide base and the converging peak created a profile that resisted tipping. The weight was distributed evenly around the circle. Even in strong wind, the force required to lift or topple the structure was far greater than the force trying to push it over, because the wind's pressure was deflected rather than applied directly. This pole framework, before the cover was even added, was already a stable, resilient structure. It could stand alone, swaying slightly in the wind but never collapsing. It was the skeleton upon which the rest of the tipi would be built. The cover of the tipi, the skin that would wrap around the pole framework and transform it into a true shelter, was traditionally made from buffalo hide. This was not simply a practical choice, it was a sacred one. The buffalo provided everything for the people of the plains: meat for food, bones for tools, sinew for thread, and hide for shelter. To live inside a home made from buffalo skin was to be wrapped in the animal's strength, its resilience, its connection to the land. The tipi was not separate from the buffalo. It was an extension of the relationship between the people and the herds they followed. A single tipi cover required many hides, 10 to 20 buffalo skins, depending on the size of the lodge. These hides had to be prepared carefully. The process began immediately after the hunt. The skin was removed from the animal, a skilled task that required cutting without puncturing or damaging the hide. The hide was then cleaned. All flesh and fat was scraped away using specialized tools. This work was labor-intensive, requiring hours of effort for each skin. The women of the tribe who owned and managed the tipis performed this work. It was their knowledge, their skill, that transformed raw hide into usable material. After cleaning, the hides were tanned. Tanning made the skin soft, pliable, and resistant to rot. The process involved treating the hide with a mixture of animal brains, liver, and other natural oils. These substances were worked into the skin, breaking down the fibers and replacing the moisture that had been lost. The hide was stretched, worked, and dried repeatedly until it achieved the right texture. Tough, yet flexible, able to withstand stress without tearing. Once tanned, the hides were ready to be sewn together. This was precision work. Each hide had to be positioned carefully to create a large semicircular piece that would wrap around the tipi's pole frame. The edges were matched, overlapped slightly, and stitched with sinew thread. Sinew, the tough fibrous tissue from the animal's back and legs, made an ideal thread. When fresh, it could be split into fine strands and softened. It was strong, far stronger than plant-based cordage, and it had a remarkable property. When it got wet, it swelled. This swelling tightened the stitches, sealing the seams and making them waterproof. A well-sewn hide cover stitched with sinew would shed rain and snow without leaking. The completed cover was massive. A 15-hide tipi cover could weigh several hundred pounds. This weight was not a disadvantage. It was an asset. The heavy cover pressed down on the poles, adding stability. It created tension in the structure, locking everything together. And once stretched taut, that weight helped the cover resist being lifted or torn by the wind. When it was time to erect the tipi, the cover was spread out on the ground near the completed pole framework. One edge of the cover was attached to a lifting pole, a separate pole used specifically for this purpose. The lifting pole was then raised, carrying the cover upward until it could be draped over the standing framework. Once in position, the cover was wrapped around the poles. The two front edges, which would meet at the entrance, were pulled together and fastened with wooden lacing pins. These pins threaded through pre-made holes in the hide, like the laces on a boot, pulling the cover tight and creating a sealed front seam. The critical step was stretching the cover taut. A loose cover would flap in the wind, catching the air like a sail. It would tear itself apart, but a taut cover became a single unified surface. The hide was pulled down firmly around the entire base of the tipi. Around the bottom edge were loops, sewn or attached at regular intervals. Through these loops, wooden stakes were driven. Not small tent stakes, but substantial pegs, sometimes 2 feet long, driven deep into the prairie sod. 24 stakes or more encircling the entire base, each one anchoring a section of the cover to the ground. This anchoring was vital. The wind flowing over the cone would create lift, trying to pull the cover upward, but the stakes held it fast. The tautness of the cover meant there were no loose sections to catch the wind, and the combined holding power of dozens of stakes distributed around the circumference was immense. The hide itself had another quality. It thrummed. When the wind struck a taut buffalo hide cover, it did not produce a sharp flapping sound. It created a deep resonant drumming, a rhythmic vibration that travelled through the material. This sound was constant but not chaotic. It was predictable, steady, a low hum that filled the interior of the tipi. For those inside, this sound became familiar. It was the sound of the tipi working, the sound of the wind being managed and deflected. It was not the crack of breaking wood or the tear of ripping fabric. It was the sound of safety. In later years, after sustained contact with traders, canvas began to replace buffalo hide. Canvas was lighter, easier to transport, and did not require the same intensive preparation. But it served the same function. It was stretched taut over the poles, pegged to the ground, and transformed from simple cloth into a resilient shell. The principles remained the same, whether the material was hide or canvas. At the very top of the tipi, where all the poles converged, there was an opening. This hole was not a weakness or an oversight, it was essential. Inside the tipi, a fire would burn. For warmth, for light, for cooking. Fire creates smoke, and smoke in an enclosed space is deadly. The opening at the apex allowed smoke to escape, but it was not simply a fixed hole. It was controlled by two large flaps, one on each side of the opening. These flaps, sometimes called smoke flaps or ears, were adjustable. They could be opened wide or closed partially, angled in different directions, responding to wind and weather. Each flap was a triangular extension of the cover itself, cut and shaped specifically for this purpose. At the outer tip of each flap was a pocket into which a long pole was inserted. These poles extended all the way to the ground outside the tipi. By moving the base of these poles, a person standing on the ground could adjust the angle and position of the flaps far above. This control was critical. The goal was not simply to let smoke out. The goal was to manage airflow in a way that drew smoke up and out while preventing wind from blowing down into the tipi. On a calm day, the flaps would be opened wide, creating a large exit for smoke. The fire's heat would cause the smoke to rise naturally, and it would drift out through the opening without difficulty. But when the wind picked up, the situation changed. If the flaps were left in the wrong position, wind could blow directly down through the smoke hole. This would fill the tipi with smoke, embers, and cold air. It would make the interior uninhabitable. Worse, it could create pressure inside the tipi, inflating it like a balloon and putting immense stress on the cover and stakes. The solution was to position the flaps to create a lee, a sheltered area downwind of the opening. The smoke would be drawn into this calm pocket and then whisked away by the wind, but the wind itself could not blow down the hole. This worked through a principle called the Venturi effect. When wind accelerates over a narrow opening, it creates a zone of low pressure. By angling the flaps correctly, the wind rushing over the smoke hole would actually pull the smoke out more efficiently than on a calm day. The faster the wind, the stronger the draw. The flaps could be adjusted to respond to wind from any direction. If the wind shifted, the person tending the flaps would move the control poles, repositioning the ears to maintain the proper angle. This required attention and experience. A skilled tipi dweller could read the wind, feel its direction and strength, and adjust the flaps without even thinking. In a severe storm with winds at 100 miles per hour, this system was essential. The flaps would be angled steeply, creating maximum protection, while maintaining the draw for smoke. The fire inside could continue to burn, providing warmth and light, while the smoke escaped cleanly and the wind was kept at bay. The smoke flaps also allowed the tipi to breathe. Fresh air entered through the gap at the base of the cover, a small space by design, left between the bottom of the hide and the ground. This air would be drawn upward through the interior, pulled by the heat of the fire and the low pressure at the smoke hole and expelled along with the smoke. This created a continuous, controlled airflow. Fresh oxygen for the fire, fresh air for breathing, and a mechanism that removed smoke without creating dangerous drafts or allowing the wind to invade the sheltered space inside. The flaps were more than a chimney. They were the tipi's lungs, its connection to the moving air outside, its way of managing the storm while remaining calm within. Perhaps the most ingenious element of the tipi's design was one that remained largely invisible from the outside. Inside the cone of poles and hide, there was a second wall. This inner lining, sometimes called an ozan or dew cloth, hung from the poles at a height of about 6 feet, extending down to the floor. It created a space, a gap, between the outer cover and the inner living area. This liner was typically made from hide or canvas, lighter than the outer cover, but still substantial. It was attached to the poles with ties or loops, positioned so that it formed a continuous barrier around the interior, leaving only the central area open above, where the smoke from the fire could rise to the apex. The purpose of this liner was not immediately obvious, but it solved two critical problems that would otherwise make the tipi uncomfortable or even dangerous in severe cold and wind. The first problem was drafts. The outer cover of the tipi did not reach all the way to the ground. By design, it stopped an inch or two above the earth. This small gap served a purpose on warm days, allowing cooling air to circulate through the tipi. But in a storm, when cold wind was forced across the prairie at tremendous speed, that gap became a liability. Without the liner, cold air would blast through that gap and sweep across the floor. It would chill anyone sitting or lying near the perimeter. It would steal heat from the fire. It would make the interior miserable despite the protection from the wind outside. The liner prevented this. Cold air entering under the outer cover would be trapped in the space between the cover and the liner. It could not reach the family inside. Instead, something remarkable happened to that cold air. The fire in the centre of the tipi produced heat. That heat rose, warming the air in the living space, but the gap between the outer cover and the inner liner also contained air, cold air that had seeped in from outside. The heat from the fire warmed the edges of the liner. The cold air in the gap, now in contact with this warmth, began to heat as well. Warm air rises. As the air in the gap warmed, it rose upward along the space between the two walls. It flowed up toward the smoke hole, where it was expelled along with the smoke from the fire. This created a natural circulation pattern, a chimney effect. Fresh cold air entered at the bottom, through the gap under the outer cover. It was drawn upward through the space between the walls, warmed as it rose and expelled at the top. This circulation provided a continuous supply of fresh oxygen for the fire, keeping it burning cleanly and efficiently. And it moved the cold air away from the people inside, channeling it up and out before it could chill the living space. The result was a draft-free interior. The air inside the liner remained relatively still, warmed by the fire, protected from the wind. The cold air that might have made the floor unbearable was instead channeled harmlessly, upward and vented outside. The second problem the liner solved was insulation. The gap between the outer cover and the inner wall created a layer of trapped air. Air is an excellent insulator when it is trapped and prevented from circulating freely. This principle is the same one used in double-paned windows or the hollow fibres of animal fur. The air in the gap was warmed by the heat from the interior. It formed a buffer zone, warmer than the outside air, cooler than the inside air. This buffer reduced the rate of heat loss through the tipi's walls. The outer cover blocked the wind and shed precipitation. The inner liner, with its cushion of trapped air, provided thermal insulation. This also prevented condensation. In a cold environment, warm, moist air from breathing and cooking would normally condense on the cold inner surface of the outer cover. Water droplets would form and drip down onto the people below, soaking bedding and making the interior damp and uncomfortable. With the liner in place, the inner surface that people lived against was warmer. Moisture was less likely to condense there. Any condensation that did form would occur on the outer cover, in the gap, where it would run down the hide and soak into the ground outside the liner, away from the living space. The liner also served a cultural purpose. It was often painted or decorated. Families would adorn the inner walls with symbols, images of animals, records of important events, or spiritual designs. These paintings transformed the interior from a functional shelter into a personal, sacred space. The liner became a canvas for identity, history, and belief. The construction of the liner required careful measurement and placement. It had to hang evenly, maintaining the proper gap between itself and the outer cover all the way around. It had to be secured firmly enough that it would not sag or shift, but not so tightly that it restricted the airflow in the gap. At the base, the liner typically rested on the floor or was weighted down with stones or personal belongings. This prevented cold air from spilling over the bottom edge into the living space. The top edge, where the liner ended at about 6 feet high, was open to the central area, allowing smoke to rise freely while keeping the draft at floor level outside the living zone. In extreme cold, some families would add insulating materials between the liner and the outer cover. Dried grass, moss, or additional layers of hide could be stuffed into the gap, increasing the insulation value even further. This was particularly useful in winter camps, where the tipi would remain in one location for an extended period. The liner, then, was far more than a decorative element. It was the key to comfort. It created the calm, warm pocket of air where the family actually lived, protected not just from the wind outside, but from the cold drafts that would otherwise make survival inside the tipi difficult. It was a wall of trapped air, a thermal buffer, and a barrier against moisture, all in one simple hanging piece of hide. In the exact centre of the tipi, directly beneath the smoke hole, was the fire. This fire was not large. It was not a roaring blaze. It was small, controlled, and carefully tended. But it was the heart of the tipi, the source of heat, light, and life itself. The fire was built on the bare ground, sometimes in a shallow depression dug to contain the coals. Around it, a ring of stones might be placed to define the fire area and prevent embers from spreading. The fuel was usually wood, small branches, twigs, and split logs. On the plains, where trees were scarce, dried buffalo dung was also used. It burned steadily, producing consistent heat with minimal smoke. The size of the fire was important. A large fire would consume fuel too quickly, wasting precious resources. It would also produce too much heat, making the interior uncomfortably hot and increasing the risk of overheating the tipi or igniting the cover. And it would create more smoke than the ventilation system could handle efficiently. A small fire, tended carefully, provided just enough heat to warm the interior without overwhelming it. The heat radiated outward in all directions, warming the air and the people sitting or lying nearby. The fire's glow reflected off the inner liner, brightening the entire space with a soft orange light. The column of smoke from the fire rose straight upward. If the fire was burning cleanly, dry wood, adequate oxygen, proper ventilation, the smoke was thin and pale. It drifted up toward the smoke hole in a steady stream, drawn by the heat differential and the airflow created by the flaps and the chimney effect of the liner. Maintaining the fire required constant attention. Someone, usually a woman or older child, would be responsible for feeding it, adjusting the wood, and ensuring it burned at the right intensity. Too much fuel and it flared up, producing excess smoke and heat. Too little and it died down, leaving the tipi cold and dark. The fire also served practical purposes beyond warmth and light. Food was cooked over it, either directly on the coals or in pots suspended from tripods. Water could be heated, tools could be warmed to make them more pliable for repairs. Wet clothing could be dried near the fire's heat, though not so close that it would scorch or ignite. The fire's position in the centre was deliberate. It allowed the heat to radiate evenly to all sides. No part of the tipi was favoured or neglected. Everyone sitting or sleeping around the perimeter received warmth. The symmetry of the cone meant that the heat distribution was naturally balanced, but the fire also defined the social space of the tipi. Activities were organised around it. People gathered near it to talk, work, eat and rest. It was the focal point, the centre of attention. The fire marked the boundary between the functional space, where daily tasks occurred, and the sleeping areas along the walls. At night, the fire would be allowed to burn down to coals. A large fire was not needed during sleeping hours. The coals provided a steady low heat that maintained a baseline warmth throughout the night, without consuming excessive fuel or producing unnecessary smoke. If the night was particularly cold, a few small pieces of wood might be added to keep the coals alive, but the fire was never allowed to blaze during sleep. The light from the fire, even when reduced to coals, was comforting. It created a gentle glow that filled the interior, pushing back the complete darkness. For those inside, this light was a psychological anchor, a reminder that they were not alone, that life continued, that warmth persisted even in the coldest night. The fire's relationship with the smoke hole was a constant dance. The fire created the heat that drove the airflow. The smoke hole and flaps managed that airflow, pulling the smoke out while preventing downdrafts. The liner channeled cold air away from the living space and up toward the fire, feeding it oxygen. Everything was connected, each element supporting the others in a system that required both designed and active management. In a storm, when the wind outside reached its peak, the fire inside remained steady. The flaps above were angled correctly. The liner channeled air properly, and the fire burned on, a small, constant point of warmth and light in the centre of a structure designed to stand firm against forces that could tear apart less thoughtful homes. The entrance to the tipi was not an afterthought. Its placement and design were as intentional as every other element of the structure. The door faced east. This orientation was nearly universal among plains tribes, and it served multiple purposes: practical, cultural, and spiritual. Facing east meant facing the rising sun. Even during the polar night, when the sun might not rise fully above the horizon, the eastern sky would show the first glow of approaching dawn. This connection to the sun's path was symbolically important, representing renewal, light, and the cyclical nature of life. But the eastern orientation also had a practical benefit. The prevailing winds on the Great Plains came from the west. By placing the door on the eastern side, the entrance was sheltered from the strongest, most frequent winds. The door opened away from the prevailing weather, reducing the likelihood that wind would blow directly into the tipi when someone entered or exited. The door itself was not a hinged wooden door. It was a flap of hide, attached at the top and left free at the bottom and sides. When closed, this flap hung down over the entrance opening, sealing it against wind and cold. When someone needed to enter or exit, they simply lifted the flap and stepped through. The size of the entrance was modest, large enough for a person to pass through comfortably, but not so large that it created unnecessary heat loss. The opening was typically about 4 feet high and 2 feet wide, requiring a person to duck slightly or crouch to enter. This small size helped maintain the tipi's thermal efficiency. The entrance flap could be secured from the inside. Ties or toggles allowed the flap to be fastened shut, preventing it from blowing open in strong wind. In very cold or stormy weather, additional insulation might be added, a second flap or a layer of fur hung behind the first, to create a more effective barrier against the elements. But the most important aspect of the door's design was how it related to the tipi's overall tilt. As mentioned earlier, the tipi was often constructed with an asymmetric profile. The back wall facing west was steeper. The front wall facing east had a gentler slope. This tilt meant that the door was positioned on the more gradual slope. This served several functions. First, it made entry and exit easier. A steeper angle would have required a more awkward crouch to enter. The gentler slope allowed for a more natural movement. Second, it improved structural stability. The steep back wall acted as the primary anchor against the prevailing westerly winds. The wind would strike this steep surface and be deflected upward. The gentler front slope allowed the wind to flow over the tipi more smoothly, reducing turbulence and pressure. Third, it created a natural drainage path. Rain or snowmelt would run down the cover and pool at the base. The tilt of the structure meant that water would naturally drain away from the entrance, keeping the doorway area drier and more comfortable. Inside the tipi, the area near the door was considered the least desirable space. It was colder, being farthest from the optimal warm air layer. It was more exposed to drafts when the door was opened, and it was the pathway for traffic in and out, making it less private and less restful. Because of this, the area near the door was often used for storage. Supplies, tools and equipment that needed to be accessible but were not in constant use were kept near the entrance. This freed up the warmer, more protected areas along the sides and back for sleeping and living space. The back of the tipi, opposite the door, was the place of honour. It was the warmest area, sheltered from the door's drafts and positioned to receive maximum heat from the fire. This is where the head of the household would sit or sleep. It was the seat of authority and respect, the most comfortable and secure position in the entire structure. The sides of the tipi, running from the door toward the back, were where other family members would arrange their sleeping areas. The exact layout varied by family size, tradition and preference, but the principle remained consistent. The closer to the back, the warmer and more protected the space. The door's design also allowed for ventilation control. On a warm day, the entrance flap could be lifted and propped open, allowing fresh air to circulate through the tipi. This cross-ventilation, combined with the smoke hole at the top, created a comfortable breeze that prevented the interior from becoming stuffy or overheated. In winter, when cold was the primary concern, the door was kept closed as much as possible. Exits and entries were minimized to reduce heat loss. When someone did need to leave or enter, they would do so quickly, and the door flap would be secured immediately behind them. The entrance to the tipi, then, was a carefully considered element of the design. Its eastern orientation, its size, its relationship to the structure's tilt, and its position relative to the interior layout all contributed to making the tipi a functional, comfortable, and resilient home. All the elements we've discussed, the cone shape, the flexible poles, the taut hide cover, The smoke flaps, the inner liner, would mean nothing if the structure could not be anchored firmly to the ground. The final critical step in building a tipi was securing the cover to the earth itself. This was done with stakes, dozens of them. Around the entire base of the tipi, where the cover met the ground, were loops or eyelets sewn or attached to the hide at regular intervals. These loops were spaced every foot or two around the circumference. For a 15-foot diameter tipi, this meant 30 to 40 stake points. The stakes themselves were wooden pegs, carved from hardwood branches or saplings. They were typically 12 to 18 inches long, sharpened at one end and widened or notched at the other. The sharp end would be driven into the ground. The wider end provided a surface to strike with a stone or mallet. The process of staking began once the cover was wrapped around the poles and laced shut at the front. The cover would be pulled down firmly, stretching it taut against the pole framework. This tautness was essential. Any slack in the cover would allow it to flap and catch the wind. Starting at one point, a stake would be threaded through a loop in the cover. The stake would then be driven into the ground at an angle, sloping slightly away from the tipi. This angle provided better holding power, as the pull of the cover would tighten the stake against the soil rather than simply pulling it straight up. The prairie sod was dense. The roots of countless grasses had woven together over years, creating a tough, fibrous mat. Driving a stake through this sod required effort. A heavy stone or wooden mallet, or simply the heel of a boot, would be used to pound the stake down until it was firmly seated, with only a few inches protruding above the ground. One by one, the stakes were placed around the entire perimeter. The work proceeded methodically, ensuring even tension all around. If one section was staked too tightly while another remained loose, the cover would pull unevenly, creating stress points that could tear or weaken the structure. Once all the stakes were in place, the cover was checked. Any remaining slack was adjusted. Stakes might be driven deeper or repositioned slightly to achieve perfect tension. The goal was a drum-tight surface, smooth, taut, and uniform. The holding power of these stakes was remarkable. Each stake individually might not seem like much, but together 36 stakes distributed around a circle created an enormous collective resistance. The wind trying to lift the cover would have to overcome the holding force of all the stakes simultaneously, and the stakes were not working alone. They were driven into dense sod, which gripped them tightly. The angle of the stakes meant that any upward pull would press them more firmly into the soil. The weight of the cover itself, several hundred pounds, added downward force that opposed any lifting. In extreme wind, the stakes would be tested. The wind flowing over the cone would create lift, much like the airflow over an airplane wing. This lift would try to pull the cover upward, but the stakes held. The cover might vibrate, might drum with the force of the wind, but it would not lift. It would not tear free. There was also a final anchoring option for the most severe conditions. In addition to the perimeter stakes, a rope could be attached to the very top of the tipi, where the poles came together. This rope would run down the inside of the structure and be tied to a heavy stone or a wooden stake driven deep into the floor. This central anchor acted like the mast of a ship. It held the peak of the tipi down against any updrafts or lifting forces. It was not always necessary, but in the worst storms it provided an additional measure of security, a single strong tether that prevented the entire structure from being lifted or blown over. The pegged perimeter was the final piece of the puzzle. It was the connection between the tipi and the earth, the link that transformed a clever design into a structure that could withstand the most violent forces nature could deliver. Without those stakes, driven deep into the prairie sod, the tipi would be little more than a sail. With them, it became a fortress. Inside the tipi, during a storm, there was a sound. It was constant, rhythmic, and deep. It was the sound of the wind striking the taut hide cover, and it was unlike anything heard in a modern home during severe weather. When wind hits a loose surface, a tarp, a flag, a piece of fabric, it creates a sharp, chaotic flapping. The material snaps and cracks, pulled violently in changing directions. This sound is unsettling, unpredictable, and often a sign that something is about to fail. But the tipi's cover was not loose. It was stretched tight, held firmly by stakes and tension. When the wind struck it, the hide did not flap. It vibrated. The entire surface resonated with the force of the wind, producing a low, steady drumming sound. This sound was predictable. It rose and fell with the gusts, but it maintained a consistent tone. It was not the crack of breaking wood or the tear of ripping fabric. It was a hum, a thrumming, like the beat of a distant drum or the low note of a stringed instrument. For those inside, this sound became familiar. It was the sound of the tipi working, the sound of the structure doing what it was designed to do. The wind was not getting in, the cover was not tearing, the stakes were holding, the poles were flexing but not breaking. Everything was functioning as it should. Children raised in tipis learned this sound from infancy. It was part of the soundscape of their lives, as familiar as the crackle of the fire or the voices of their family. When a storm came and the drumming began, they did not feel fear. They felt secure. The sound meant the tipi was protecting them. Even the rhythm of the sound had a calming effect. It was steady, continuous, like white noise. It masked other sounds, small creaks, the whisper of wind through the smoke hole, the settling of the fire. It created an acoustic environment that was both filled with sound and strangely quiet, a cocoon of rhythmic vibration that helped people relax and rest. The hide itself contributed to the quality of the sound. Buffalo hide, thick and fibrous, had a natural resonance. It absorbed some frequencies while amplifying others. The result was a sound that was deep and mellow, not sharp or piercing. Canvas, when it replaced buffalo hide, produced a slightly different tone. It was lighter, thinner, and had a different resonant frequency. The drumming was still present, but it had a higher pitch, a slightly sharper quality. Those who had known both could tell the difference, but the fundamental character of the sound, steady, rhythmic, reassuring, remained the same. The poles also contributed to the soundscape. Under extreme stress, they would creak slightly, a soft groaning as they flexed. This sound, too, was not alarming to those familiar with it. It was simply the poles adjusting, absorbing the wind's energy, bending without breaking. Together, these sounds created the auditory signature of a tipi in a storm. The deep drumming of the hide, the occasional creak of the poles, the steady hiss of wind at the smoke flaps. It was a symphony of materials under stress, but it was a symphony that told a story of strength and resilience, not failure. Contrast this with the sounds of a modern house in 100-mile-per-hour wind. The whistle of air through gaps, the bang and rattle of loose objects, the groan of wall studs under stress, the shattering of glass, the crack of a tree limb hitting the roof. These are sounds of danger, sounds that provoke anxiety and fear. The tipi's drumming did not provoke fear. It provided comfort. It was proof that the design was working, that the ancestors' knowledge was sound, that the family would be safe until morning. We return now to a principle mentioned earlier, but worth understanding more deeply. The tipi's strength came not from rigidity, but from flexibility. This might seem counterintuitive. We tend to think of strength as stiffness, as the ability to resist without bending. But in the face of extreme wind, flexibility is survival. A rigid structure, a wooden frame house, a brick building, is strong in its own way. It can support great weight, it can resist moderate forces, but when the force exceeds a certain threshold, when the stress concentrates at a joint or a weak point, the structure fails catastrophically. A wall cracks, a beam snaps, the entire framework can collapse in moments. The tipi did not work this way. It was built from materials that could give. The poles were wood, not steel. They could bend. In a powerful gust, the entire pole framework would shift, the tips at the top swaying several inches or even a foot. This movement absorbed the wind's energy. The cover too could flex. The hide or canvas would stretch slightly under pressure, then contract as the pressure released. This elasticity prevented the cover from tearing. If the material had been rigid, the stress would have concentrated at the stake points or the seams, and it would have ripped, but by stretching and absorbing the force, the cover remained intact. Even the stakes driven into the earth had some give. The sod itself could compress slightly. The stakes could shift minutely under extreme pull. This was not failure, it was accommodation. The entire system was designed to absorb and dissipate energy rather than resist it absolutely. This principle can be seen in nature. Trees in a windstorm do not stand rigid. They sway. Their trunks bend, their branches flex. The trees that survive are the ones that can move with the wind. The ones that try to resist, the ones that are too stiff snap and fall. The tipi embodied this natural wisdom. It moved with the storm. In doing so, it survived the storm. The flexibility also had another benefit. It prevented the build-up of resonant vibrations. In some rigid structures, wind can create a feedback loop, a specific frequency that matches the natural frequency of the structure. When this happens, the vibrations amplify, and the structure can shake itself apart even if the wind is not strong enough to blow it over directly. The tipi, with its flexible materials and irregular geometry, did not have a single resonant frequency. It absorbed vibrations across a range of frequencies, dissipating them before they could build up. The result was a structure that remained stable even in chaotic, turbulent wind. This flexibility required a certain amount of tension to work properly. The cover had to be taut, the poles had to be seated correctly, the stakes had to be driven firmly. Too much slack and the flexibility became looseness, and the structure would fail. But when everything was in balance, the tipi became a living thing, breathing, flexing, yielding, and holding firm all at once. Chapter 12, Platforms of Warmth. Inside the tipi, the floor was not uniform. The ground itself was flat, but the living space was organised into levels. The area near the door remained at ground level. But as you moved toward the back of the tipi, away from the entrance, the floor rose. This elevation was created deliberately. The builders would construct a raised platform using stow blocks in winter or packed earth and brush in other seasons. This platform, extending along the back and sides of the tipi, stood 12 to 18 inches above the main floor level. The platform was not merely for comfort or convenience, it was a critical element of the tipi's thermal management. Warm air rises. This is a basic principle of physics. Air that is heated becomes less dense, and it floats upward above cooler, denser air. Inside the tipi, the fire in the centre heated the air around it. That warm air rose toward the smoke hole, but as it rose it also spread outward, filling the upper portion of the interior space. The warmest air collected not at ground level, but at the height of a sitting or lying person, roughly 3 to 5 feet above the floor. By raising the sleeping and living areas onto platforms, the occupants positioned themselves directly in this warm air layer. They were lifted out of the coldest zone, which remained at floor level, and placed into the zone where the heat from the fire was most effective. The difference in temperature between floor level and platform level could be significant. Even a difference of 10 or 15 degrees meant the difference between discomfort and rest, between shivering and sleeping soundly. The platform also served a practical purpose. It provided a clear division between the working area and the resting area. The floor near the fire and the door was where daily activities occurred: cooking, tool maintenance, entry and exit. The platform was reserved for sitting, relaxing and sleeping. This division helped organise the limited space inside the tipi efficiently. The construction of the platform began with a foundation. In winter, blocks of packed snow could be cut and stacked to create a stable base. In warmer seasons, logs, branches or stones were arranged to form the structure. The top surface was made as level as possible, then covered with layers of insulation. The first layer of insulation was often willow branches or other woody material. These branches were laid across the platform in a dense mat. They created a springy supportive surface while also trapping air between their irregular shapes. This air provided insulation from the cold ground or snow below. On top of the branches, dried grasses were spread. Arctic cotton grass, when available, was particularly valued. Its fine, soft texture created a thick insulating layer. Sedges, dried leaves, or even moss could serve the same purpose. The goal was to create a cushioning layer that would trap air and prevent heat loss through conduction to the ground. Finally, hides were laid over the grass. These hides formed the actual sleeping surface. Buffalo robes were preferred, thick, warm, with the fur side up. The hollow hairs of the buffalo fur created thousands of tiny air pockets, providing exceptional insulation and softness. The hides also protected the grass layer from being compressed or scattered during use. The total thickness of these layers, branches, grass and hides, could be 6 to 8 inches. This created a comfortable, warm sleeping surface that insulated the body from the cold below while positioning the sleeper in the warmest air zone above. The size and shape of the platform varied with the size of the tipi and the number of occupants. In a small hunting shelter, the platform might be a simple raised area along one side, large enough for 1 or 2 people. In a family tipi, the platform would extend around much of the interior, creating multiple sleeping areas. The edges of the platform where it met the tipi's walls were particularly important. This is where the inner liner hung down, creating the barrier between the living space and the cold air gap. The platform needed to be positioned so that the liner rested on, or just behind its edge, preventing cold air from spilling over into the sleeping area. Some families would create different platform levels. A lower level for general sitting and working, a higher level for sleeping. This terracing maximised the use of vertical space and allowed for even more precise positioning in the warmest air layers. The platform also became a place of personalisation. Families would arrange their belongings around their sleeping areas: clothing, weapons, tools, personal items. Backrests made from willow rods lashed together and covered with hide provided support for sitting. These backrests could be adjusted to different angles, allowing people to recline comfortably while talking, eating, or working. At night, when it was time to sleep, the family would gather on the platform. They would arrange themselves in a pattern that maximised warmth sharing and protection. Adults often positioned themselves on the outer edges, creating a barrier of body heat that shielded children in the centre. Everyone slept with their feet toward the fire and their heads toward the wall, taking advantage of the radiant heat, while keeping their breathing away from the smoke. Additional robes and hides were used as blankets. These were layered over the sleeping family, creating an insulating cocoon. The combination of the insulated platform below, the warm air layer around them, and the covering robes above meant that even when the temperature outside was far below freezing, the family could sleep in relative comfort. The platform, then, was far more than a raised floor. It was a carefully engineered thermal zone positioned to capture the warmth generated by the fire, insulated from the cold below and arranged to promote both comfort and efficient use of space. It transformed the tipi from a shelter into a home, a place where rest was possible even in the harshest conditions. The buffalo provided more than just the hide for the tipi's cover. It also provided the warmest natural insulation available on the Great Plains. Buffalo fur, when properly prepared, became clothing, blankets, and robes that made survival in extreme cold possible. The secret of buffalo fur's warmth lies in the structure of each individual hair. Unlike solid fibres, buffalo hairs are hollow. The outer shell of the hair provides durability and water resistance, but inside there is an empty core, a tiny tube filled with air. This hollow structure serves the same purpose as the double walls of the tipi. Air is a poor conductor of heat. By trapping air inside each hair, the buffalo creates thousands upon thousands of tiny insulation chambers. A single square inch of buffalo hide can contain several thousand hairs. Each hair contains trapped air. The cumulative effect is extraordinary. This adaptation evolved to help the buffalo survive the plains winter. The animals grow a thick winter coat, with the hollow hairs becoming longer and denser as the weather turns cold. This coat allows buffalo to withstand temperatures far below zero, standing in open fields with wind blowing across their massive bodies, yet remaining warm enough to survive. For the people who hunted these animals, the winter coat was the most valuable. A buffalo taken in late autumn or early winter would have the thickest, warmest fur. These hides were carefully processed and reserved for the most critical uses: inner clothing layers, sleeping robes, and protection for the very young and very old. The hollow structure also makes buffalo fur remarkably light for its warmth. Unlike solid hair furs that achieve insulation through sheer thickness and density, buffalo fur achieves it through its internal air chambers. A person can wear substantial buffalo fur clothing without being burdened by excessive weight. The structure of the hide itself adds another layer to the insulation system. Buffalo hide has two distinct layers of hair. The outer layer consists of longer guard hairs. These hairs are coarser, more weather-resistant. They shed water and snow, preventing moisture from penetrating to the skin. They also protect the softer underfur beneath. The underfur is shorter, denser, and softer. This is where the primary insulation occurs. The fine, hollow hairs pack together, creating a thick mat that traps warm air close to the skin. The guard hairs above act as a windbreak and weather barrier, while the underfur below provides the thermal protection. When a buffalo hide was made into a robe or garment, the orientation of the fur mattered. Fur worn with the hair facing outward provided maximum protection from wind and precipitation. The guard hairs would deflect snow and sleet, and the air trapped in the fur would prevent wind from penetrating to the body. Fur worn with the hair facing inward against the skin created a different effect. The soft underfur would trap body heat directly, creating an insulating layer right at the skin surface. This was particularly effective for sleeping robes, where the goal was to retain warmth rather than shed weather. Traditional clothing systems often used both orientations. An inner garment would be worn with fur facing in, trapping body heat. An outer garment would be worn with fur facing out, protecting against wind and moisture. The combination created a layered insulation system that rivaled anything modern technology has produced. The preparation of buffalo hides was skilled work. The hide had to be cleaned thoroughly. removing all flesh and fat without damaging the hair roots. If the hair slipped, if it began to fall out, the hide was ruined as insulation. Proper tanning preserved the hair structure while making the hide supple and comfortable to wear. Once prepared, buffalo robes were used in multiple ways inside the tipi. They covered the sleeping platforms, providing both cushioning and warmth. They were wrapped around people sitting near the fire on cold days. They were draped over children and elders who needed extra protection. They became blankets for sleeping, often shared by multiple family members. The durability of buffalo fur was also important. These robes had to withstand constant use throughout the winter. They had to be sat on, slept under, worn as wraps, and sometimes used as padding or protection for other purposes. Properly prepared buffalo hide could last for years with appropriate care. That care included keeping the fur dry. Wet fur loses much of its insulating value. The water displaces the air in the hollow cores, and the fur mats down, losing its loft. For this reason, buffalo robes inside the tipi were kept away from areas where moisture might accumulate. After any exposure to dampness, they would be dried carefully near the fire, fluffed and stored properly. The hollow hairs of the buffalo, then, were not just a fortunate accident of nature. They were a critical resource as important as the hide for the tipi cover or the meat for food. They represented the warmest natural insulation available, and they made the difference between mere survival and genuine comfort during the long cold nights when the wind howled outside and the temperature plummeted far below freezing. Clothing for the plains. Winter followed the same principles as the tipi itself. Multiple layers, trapped air, careful management of moisture and heat. The traditional clothing system, refined over generations, created a microclimate around the human body that allowed people to function in conditions that would quickly kill an unprepared person. The system began with an inner layer. This garment, called an atagi in some traditions, was made from hide or fur worn with the fur side facing inward against the skin. The soft fur created a warm layer directly against the body, trapping heat in the hollow cores of the hair. This inner garment was not worn loosely. It fit relatively snugly, conforming to the body's shape. This close fit minimized the amount of airspace that needed to be heated, while still allowing freedom of movement. The garment covered the torso, arms, and often extended down to mid-thigh or knee level, providing comprehensive coverage. The construction of the inner layer required precision. The hide had to be cut in a way that allowed natural movement without binding or restricting. Different tribes had different patterns, but all shared common principles. The shoulders needed freedom for reaching and throwing. The torso needed to accommodate breathing and bending. The length needed to protect without interfering with walking or running. Seams were positioned carefully. A seam across the shoulders, where a weapon or tool might rub repeatedly, would wear out quickly, so seams were often placed along the sides or back where friction was less intense. Each seam was sewn with fine sinew thread, using small tight stitches that would not pull apart under stress. The hide used for the inner layer was typically from younger animals, where the fur was softer and finer. Fawn caribou, taken in early autumn, provided especially desirable material. The fur was dense but not coarse, comfortable against the skin and even during extended wear. Around the neck, the inner garment would fit closely but not tightly. Too loose and warm air would escape. Too tight and it would restrict breathing and feel uncomfortable. The opening was just large enough to pull the garment over the head, and it could be adjusted with drawstrings or ties to seal against drafts. The sleeves extended to the wrists, where they ended in fitted cuffs. These cuffs prevented cold air from travelling up the arms when the hands were raised or extended. The cuffs could also be tucked into mittens, creating a continuous seal from shoulder to fingertip. The inner layer also served to wick moisture away from the skin. The human body produces moisture constantly through perspiration, even in cold weather. This moisture is not always visible as sweat. It occurs as insensible perspiration, water vapour that evaporates continuously from the skin surface. Physical exertion increases this moisture production dramatically. If that moisture is allowed to accumulate against the skin, several problems arise. First, water is an excellent conductor of heat. Wet skin loses heat much faster than dry skin. Second, when moisture evaporates, it requires energy, heat energy, to change from liquid to vapour. This process actively cools the body, stealing warmth at precisely the moment when warmth is most needed. The fur against the skin absorbed this moisture and moved it outward, away from the body. The structure of the hair, hollow cores surrounded by scales, allowed water vapour to migrate along the hair shaft. The moisture would travel from the base of the hair, where it was in contact with skin, toward the tip, where it was exposed to air. This wicking action kept the skin relatively dry. The moisture that had been absorbed by the inner layer's fur would then migrate to the outer surface of that garment, where it would evaporate into the space between the inner and outer layers. Over the inner garment, a second layer was worn. This outer garment was also made from hide and fur, but it was worn with the fur facing outward. The coarse guard hairs faced the elements, shedding snow and wind. This outer layer was worn more loosely than the inner layer, creating a space, a gap of air, between the two garments. The construction of the outer layer followed similar principles as the inner, but with important differences. The hide used was from mature animals, where the fur was longer, denser, and more weather-resistant. Winter-killed caribou or buffalo provided the best material, as their coats had fully developed for cold weather protection. The outer garment was cut larger than the inner one. This created the critical air gap. The exact dimension of this gap, typically 1 to 2 inches, was not arbitrary. It represented generations of experience in balancing insulation with mobility. Too small a gap, and the insulation value decreased. The two layers would press against each other, compressing the fur and eliminating the airspace. Too large a gap, and convection currents could form. Air inside the gap, if given too much room, would circulate. Warm air would rise, cool air would sink, and this circulation would transport heat away from the body more quickly than still air would. The optimal gap allowed air to warm from body heat but not to circulate freely. The air became trapped, forming an insulating buffer that was warmer than the outside but cooler than the body. This buffer zone dramatically slowed heat loss. The outer garment also served as a weather barrier in ways the inner layer did not. Wind could not penetrate the dense outer fur. The guard hairs were long enough and thick enough to create a nearly impenetrable barrier. Snow and sleet that struck the outer surface would be shed by these guard hairs before they could reach the skin of the hide, let alone penetrate to the inner layer. Rain posed a particular challenge. Water could, if the fur became saturated, eventually penetrate even good hide, but the outer guard hairs, especially from caribou or buffalo, had a natural water-repellent quality. The structure of the hair, scales overlapping like roof shingles, caused water to bead up and run off rather than soaking in. This water resistance was enhanced by natural oils in the fur. These oils, preserved during the tanning process, gave the hair a slightly greasy feel. This coating helped water slide off rather than penetrating. If the fur did get wet, it could be shaken out and much of the water would be thrown off immediately. Seams in both garments were carefully constructed to prevent heat loss and water penetration. They were overlapped and sewn with sinew, which swelled when wet to seal the stitching. But the design went further. The seams in the inner and outer layers were offset, not aligned, so there was no straight path for cold air or water to penetrate through both layers. Where the inner layer had a seam down the back, the outer layer might have seams along the sides. Where the inner layer's sleeves attached at the shoulders, the outer layer's attachment might be slightly forward or back. This deliberate misalignment created a baffled system, where any gap in one layer was covered by solid material in the other. The hood of the outer garment was particularly important and sophisticated. Heat loss from the head can be substantial. The head, with its rich blood supply close to the surface and its large surface area relative to volume, can account for significant total body heat loss in cold conditions. A well-designed hood enclosed the head and face, with only a small opening for the eyes and mouth. The construction had to balance protection with visibility and breathing. The opening had to be small enough to minimize heat loss, but large enough that the wearer could see in all directions and breathe without restriction. The fur around this opening acted as a windbreak, creating a pocket of calmer air in front of the face. But not all furs worked equally well for this purpose. Some furs collected frost from exhaled breath, building up ice that would eventually restrict the opening or press uncomfortably against the face. Certain furs resisted this frost build-up better than others. Wolverine fur was prized above all for hood ruffs. The structure of wolverine guard hairs prevented ice crystals from bonding strongly. Frost that formed on wolverine fur could be brushed or shaken off easily, even in extreme cold. Fox and wolf fur also worked well, though not quite as effectively as wolverine. The hood was often detachable or could be thrown back when not needed. In milder weather, or when engaged in vigorous activity, wearing the hood up would cause overheating. The ability to adjust hood position allowed for temperature regulation without removing entire garments. Mittens followed the same double-layer principle as body garments. Inner mittens with fur facing in, outer mittens with fur facing out and an air gap between. But hands presented unique challenges. Hands need to maintain dexterity for the essential tasks. They must grip weapons, manipulate tools, handle ropes and ties. At the same time, hands are extremely vulnerable to cold. Their small size means they have a large surface area relative to their volume, so they lose heat rapidly. Their distance from the body's core means blood reaching the hands has already cooled somewhat, and the fingers, being thin, have little mass to retain heat. The mittens had to provide warmth while preserving some degree of function. The inner mittens were soft, fitting the hand closely. They allowed the fingers to maintain some tactile sensitivity, some ability to feel what was being held. The outer mittens were larger, more heavily insulated, providing the primary protection against cold and wind. For tasks requiring fine motor control, the outer mittens could be removed temporarily, leaving the inner mittens in place. This allowed brief periods of detailed work without exposing bare skin to the cold. When the task was complete, the outer mittens would be replaced immediately. Some designs included a thumb that could be separated from the fingers, creating a two-part mitten that allowed more dexterity than a solid bag, but more warmth than individual finger gloves. This compromise worked well for tasks like handling weapons or adjusting equipment. The mittens were often attached to cords that ran up the sleeves and across the back of the outer garment. This prevented them from being lost if they had to be removed temporarily. A lost mitten in winter could mean the loss of a hand to frostbite, so this simple precaution was essential. Footwear also used layering, though the construction differed from body garments due to the unique demands placed on feet. Inner socks or liners made from soft fur, worn inside boots that had tougher outer soles and weather-resistant uppers, but feet faced challenges that hands did not. Feet had to support the body's entire weight. They had to withstand the grinding and flexing of walking, sometimes for hours at a time. They had to maintain their insulation despite being compressed between the body's weight and the frozen ground. And they were more likely to get wet, from snow entering the boot or from perspiration that had nowhere else to go. The inner foot covering was typically made from soft caribou fur, with the hair facing inward. This created a warm layer directly against the foot, but beneath this, dried grass was often added as an additional insulating layer. Arctic cotton grass, harvested during the brief summer months, was particularly valued for this purpose. The grass served multiple functions. It provided additional insulation, creating more trapped air around the foot. It absorbed moisture from foot perspiration, keeping the skin drier. And it could be removed and dried each night, then replaced, ensuring that the foot covering remained effective day after day. The boots themselves were made from hide, often sealskin for its water resistance and flexibility. The soles were particularly important. They had to be thick enough to insulate the foot from the frozen ground, tough enough to resist wear from walking, yet flexible enough to allow natural foot movement. Bearded sealskin was preferred for boot soles. When properly prepared, it developed a tough, durable texture that could withstand tremendous wear. The preparation involved specialized techniques, sometimes chewing the hide to soften it, sometimes treating it with oils or through repeated wetting and drying cycles. The upper part of the boot extended well above the ankle, often reaching to the knee or higher. This height prevented snow from entering and provided insulation for the lower leg. The junction between boot and leg garment was carefully managed, with the leggings or pants extending down over the boot top and ties or drawstrings securing the seal. Moisture management in footwear was a constant challenge. Feet produce considerable perspiration, even in cold weather. If this moisture was allowed to accumulate inside the boot, it would saturate the fur and grass linings, destroying their insulation value. Worse, it would freeze, creating ice inside the boot that would chill the foot and potentially cause frostbite. The solution required daily maintenance. Each evening, boots would be removed. The grass liners would be pulled out and dried near the fire. The fur liners would be shaken out and aired. The boots themselves would be turned inside out if possible, or at least opened fully and positioned near the fire's warmth to drive out moisture. This drying process was critical. It could not be rushed. Placing wet boots too close to the fire would cause the hide to shrink or crack. But it had to be thorough. Any remaining moisture would freeze overnight and make the boots unwearable the next morning. Experience taught the proper distance from the fire, the proper duration of drying, the signs that the boots were ready to be used again. The entire clothing system required ongoing maintenance and adjustment. This was not something that could be set up once and forgotten. It demanded constant attention throughout the winter. Each morning, before going outside, clothing would be inspected. Any ice or frost build-up would be brushed off. The outer layer would be shaken to fluff the fur and restore its loft. The fit would be checked. Had any ties or drawstrings loosened during the night? Throughout the day, adjustments would be made based on activity level and conditions. During vigorous activity like running or hard labour, body heat production increased dramatically. If all layers remained in place, the person would overheat. Sweat would be produced in large quantities. This sweat would saturate the clothing, destroying its insulation. To prevent this, layers would be removed or ventilation increased before overheating occurred. The outer garment might be opened at the chest or removed entirely. The hood would be thrown back, mittens would be removed or loosened. This preemptive adjustment required experience and judgment. The tendency for someone unaccustomed to the system was to wait until they felt hot before adjusting. But by that time, sweating had already begun. The experienced wearer would adjust based on anticipation, knowing that this particular activity, in these particular conditions, would generate this much heat, and adjusting before the sweating started. During rest periods, layers would be replaced immediately. Body heat production would drop as activity ceased, and without the insulation the person would begin to cool rapidly. The art was in timing the adjustments, removing layers just before overheating, replacing them just before cooling began, ventilation. Systems built into the garments allowed for finer control. Openings at the wrists could be loosened to allow warm air to escape and cool air to enter. The chest area might have laces or ties that could be opened partially, creating a chimney effect where warm air rose and escaped while cooler air entered at the waist. The waist itself often had adjustable closures that could regulate airflow. These ventilation adjustments allowed temperature control without the need to remove entire layers. They were particularly useful during activities where conditions changed frequently, hunting, where periods of sitting still alternated with bursts of intense activity, or travel, where exertion levels varied with terrain. Children's clothing followed the same layering principles but required special considerations. Children had higher surface area to volume ratios than adults, meaning they lost heat more quickly. Their smaller bodies had less mass to generate and store heat, and young children might not yet have learned to communicate when they were getting cold, making it difficult for caregivers to know when adjustments were needed. For infants and very young children, additional layers were often added. A child might wear not 2 but 3 layers, an inner fur layer, a middle insulating layer, and an outer weather barrier. They would be wrapped in additional robes when stationary, and they would be checked frequently for signs of cold, pale skin, shivering lethargy. Older children, once they could walk and play, faced a different challenge. They generated significant heat through their activity, but often did not yet have the judgment to adjust their clothing appropriately. They might play vigorously, overheat and sweat, then stand still and cool rapidly, all without thinking to adjust their layers. Parents and elders watched children carefully during winter, reminding them to adjust clothing, helping younger ones with ties and fastenings they could not manage themselves. The teaching of proper clothing management began early and was reinforced constantly until it became automatic. Elders faced challenges similar to children in some ways. Older bodies often produced less heat, had slower circulation, and were more vulnerable to cold injury. But elders also had the advantage of experience. They knew their own body's responses, knew exactly when and how to adjust their clothing, knew the early warning signs of cold injury. Elders might wear additional insulation layers that younger adults would find excessive. They might stay closer to the fire, venture outside less frequently, and wrap themselves in extra robes. This was not weakness but the wisdom, conserving energy, avoiding unnecessary risk, using experience to compensate for the body's gradual decline in heat production. The cultural and social aspects of clothing were also significant. The quality and decoration of a person's clothing indicated their status, skill, and family connections. A well-made outfit with fine stitching, carefully matched furs, and decorative elements showed that the wearer had access to resources and skilled labour. Women, as the primary manufacturers of clothing, gained status through their skill. A woman known for making particularly good garments, warm, durable, well-fitted, would be respected and sought out for advice. Her daughters would be taught carefully, and her family would be well-dressed. Decorative elements on clothing served multiple purposes. Quillwork or beadwork in geometric patterns made garments distinctive and beautiful. These decorations might indicate clan affiliation, commemorate significant events, or simply express the maker's artistic vision. The time and skill required to create such decoration added value to the garment. but decoration had to be balanced with function. Excessive decoration could add weight, create points where moisture could collect, or interfere with the garment's primary purpose of providing warmth. The best decorated garments integrated beauty with utility, enhancing rather than compromising function. Repair and maintenance of clothing was a constant occupation during winter months. The harsh conditions meant that wear occurred rapidly. Seams stressed by movement would begin to separate. Fur exposed to repeated wetting and drying would begin to thin. Hide subject to flexing would develop weak spots or small tears. Evening hours in the tipi were often devoted to these repairs. Using sinew thread and bone needles, torn seams would be restitched. Weak areas would be reinforced with patches. Worn fur might be replaced with fresh pieces. This maintenance work ensured that the clothing remained functional throughout the winter. The work was social. Multiple family members might be working on different garments simultaneously, sitting around the fire in companionable activity. Skill and knowledge would be shared. An elder showing a younger person the proper way to reinforce a seam, a parent teaching a child the right stitch pattern for waterproof construction. This maintenance time was also when improvements would be considered and implemented. A sleeve that proved too tight could be altered. A hood that didn't quite fit properly could be adjusted. Each winter season provided lessons about what worked and what didn't, and the clothing would be modified accordingly. Storage and care of clothing during the brief summer months was also important. Furs had to be protected from insects, especially moths, which would eat the fur and destroy insulation. Hides had to be kept away from moisture that could promote rot. The clothing that had provided life-saving warmth in winter would need to survive the summer in good condition, ready for the next cold season. Garments would be thoroughly cleaned, removing any accumulated oils, dirt, or the debris. They would be aired in the sun, which helped kill insects and their eggs. They would be stored in sealed containers or hung where air could circulate but insects could not reach. Some families used smoke as a deterrent, hanging garments in the smoke of certain plants that repelled insects. The entire clothing system then was not a static set of garments but a dynamic practice. It required knowledge, skill, constant attention and adjustment. It was taught from childhood, refined throughout life, and passed to the next generation as essential survival knowledge. When combined with the shelter of the tipi, this clothing system created a complete thermal environment. A person could step outside into air cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, yet remain warm enough to function, to hunt, to travel, to live. They could lie down to sleep in a tipi with temperatures far below freezing outside, yet rest comfortably through the night. This was not magic. It was not luck. It was the result of thousands of years of observation, experiment, failure, success, and gradual refinement. It was the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, distilled into layers of fur and hide, arranged in specific ways, maintained with specific practices, worn with specific knowledge. The double-layer clothing system, like the tipi itself, stands as testament to what human beings can achieve through patience, attention, and respect for the environment they inhabit. It shows that survival in extreme conditions is possible not through dominating nature, but through understanding it, working with its principles, and creating systems that leverage rather than fight against natural forces. And for those who mastered this system, who wore their layers correctly and maintained them properly, the reward was not merely survival but comfort. They could live full lives in a landscape that seemed impossibly harsh. They could raise children, care for elders, hunt, travel, work, play and rest, all because they knew how to dress properly for the cold. As evening settled over the plains, the family would prepare for the night. The fire would be tended one last time, built up slightly, to provide warmth through the early hours of sleep. The smoke flaps would be checked, adjusted for the night's anticipated wind. The entrance flap would be secured. Inside the tipi, on the raised platform, the sleeping areas were arranged. Each person had their place determined by family structure, age, and tradition. The arrangement was not random. It was designed to maximize warmth sharing and ensure the safety and comfort of all. The adults typically positioned themselves on the outer edges of the sleeping area, closer to the walls. Children occupied the more central positions. This arrangement meant that the children, who lost heat more quickly due to their smaller size, were surrounded by the warmth of adult bodies. They were shielded, protected, kept in the warmest zone. The head of the household, usually the father or eldest male, would sleep at the back of the tipi, in the place of honor. This was the warmest spot farthest from the door, closest to the central fire, and most protected by the tipi's design. The position reflected both status and responsibility. He was the protector, the provider, and he needed to be rested and strong. The mother and younger children would arrange themselves nearby. Infants and very small children might sleep between parents, wrapped in the same robes, sharing body heat directly. Older children would have their own robes, but would sleep close enough that the family formed a continuous line of warmth along the platform. Everyone slept with their feet pointed toward the fire. This orientation ensured that the radiant heat from the coals warmed their feet, which were most vulnerable to cold. The head was pointed outward, toward the liner and the wall. The back of the head rested on or near the liner, which blocked drafts and provided a slightly warmer surface than the open air. The sleeping position was typically on the side or back, covered with buffalo robes. These robes were heavy, substantial. They pressed down on the body, creating a sealed cocoon of warmth. The weight was comforting, a physical presence that signaled safety and security. Some families used willow rod backrests as pillows, adjusting them to a flat or slightly inclined position for sleeping. Others used rolled-up clothing or hides. The goal was to keep the head elevated slightly, maintaining clear airways and preventing the sleeper from rolling into an uncomfortable position. The space around the sleeping family was organized for accessibility and safety. Essential items, weapons, tools, emergency supplies, were kept within reach but secured so they would not be disturbed during sleep. Water containers were positioned where they could be accessed without leaving the warmth of the robes. The fire in the center was allowed to burn down. A large fire was not necessary during sleep. The tipi's insulation, the body heat of the family, and the layers of robes provided sufficient warmth. The fire would be reduced to a bed of coals glowing softly, radiating gentle heat without producing excessive light or consuming fuel too quickly. If the night was particularly cold, someone might wake once or twice to add a small piece of wood to the coals, maintaining a minimal flame. But this was done quickly, without fully waking, a practiced motion born from years of winter nights. As the family settled, the sounds of the evening would gradually quiet. The murmur of conversation would fade. The small movements of adjustment, shifting robes, settling into position, finding comfort, would cease. The interior of the tipi would fall silent except for the crackle of the fire and the breathing of the sleepers. Outside, the wind might be rising. The temperature might be dropping. A storm might be building on the horizon. But inside, under the layers of fur, surrounded by family, positioned in the warm air layer above the platform, the people slept. The drumming sound of wind on the hide. Cover would begin if the storm arrived. That deep, rhythmic thrumming would fill the tipi, but it would not wake the sleepers. It was a familiar sound, a sound that meant the tipi was doing its work. It was not a sound of danger, but a sound of protection. The poles might creak slightly as they flexed. The fire might pop as a coal split. But these sounds too were part of the night's familiar symphony. They did not alarm. They reassured. Sleep in the tipi was not fitful or anxious. It was deep, restorative rest. The body's core temperature was maintained. The extremities were warm. The air was breathable, fresh from the carefully managed ventilation. The darkness was not absolute. The faint glow of the coals provided a dim, comforting light. Dreams came in this space. Stories lived in the warmth. The knowledge of generations whispered through the painted symbols on the liner. The buffalo's strength surrounded the sleepers in the form of hide and fur. The ancestors' wisdom held them safe in the shape of the cone and the placement of the stakes. And when morning came, or what passed for morning in the winter months, the family would wake to find themselves unchanged. The tipi would be standing, the fire would be coals ready to be rekindled. The storm, if there had been one, would have passed or would be passing, and another day would begin, another cycle in the rhythm of life on the plains. There were nights when the wind did not merely blow, it screamed. Nights when the storm arrived with full force, when the pressure dropped and the sky turned dark and the wind accelerated across the open prairie with nothing to slow it. On these nights, the tipi faced its greatest test. And on these nights, the people inside experienced something profound. Not fear, but calm. Not anxiety about the storm, but confidence in the shelter. The storm would announce itself. The air would change. The temperature would drop suddenly, or the wind would shift direction. Clouds would mass on the horizon, building into towering columns. Those outside would see it coming and would retreat to their lodges, securing everything, preparing for the hours ahead. Inside the teepee, final adjustments would be made. The smoke flaps would be repositioned, angled to create the best draw for the anticipated wind direction. The entrance flap would be checked, tied firmly. Any items that might shift or fall would be secured. The fire would be tended, built to a level that would provide steady heat without requiring attention during the storm's peak. Then the waiting, and then the arrival. The first gusts would strike. The hide cover would shudder, the poles would creak, the stakes in the ground would take the first pull of tension, and the drumming would begin. At first it was irregular. Gusts would hit, then subside. The sound would rise and fall, but as the storm intensified, as the wind became constant rather than intermittent, the drumming would settle into its steady rhythm. This was the sound that defined the experience. Not the howl of wind through gaps, as in a poorly sealed house. Not the whistle of air through cracks. Not the bang and crash of objects being torn loose. Just the deep, resonant thrumming of taut hide vibrating under the wind's pressure. The hide was so tightly stretched that it acted like the skin of a joe. The wind was the hand striking it. And the sound it produced was low frequency, steady, almost musical. It filled the interior space completely, a wall of sound that was paradoxically soothing. For the children in the teepee, this was the sound of safety. They had heard it all their lives, their parents had heard it all their lives, their grandparents before them. It was the sound that meant the teepee was holding, that the design was working, that they were protected. The poles would creak more noticeably during the strongest gusts. The entire structure would shift slightly, the poles bending a few inches at their tips, the base remaining firm. This movement was not alarming. It was expected. It was the flexibility that prevented breaking. Outside, the wind might be reaching 80, 90, 100 miles per hour. Snow might be driving horizontally, or rain might be sheeting across the landscape. Lightning might split the sky. Thunder might roll across the prairie. But inside the teepee, none of this could touch the family. The wind could not enter. The smoke flaps, properly adjusted, prevented downdrafts. The entrance flap, tied securely, blocked cold air from rushing in. The stakes, driven deep, held the cover to the ground against the lifting force of the wind. The temperature inside remained stable. The fire continued to burn, its smoke drawn cleanly upward and out. The inner liner blocked drafts. The raised platform kept the family in the warm air zone. The buffalo robes wrapped around them trapped their body heat. And so as the storm raged, the family could rest. They could sit together, talking quietly if they wished. They could work on small tasks, repairing tools, sewing, telling stories, or they could simply lie down and sleep, trusting the shelter completely. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. To be able to rest, to sleep soundly, while one of the most violent forces in nature attacks your home, this is profound security. It requires absolute faith in the structure, and that faith was earned, proven over countless storms, passed down through generations. The children would often fall asleep to the drumming. It became a lullaby, white noise that masked other sounds and created a cocoon of familiar rhythm. They would curl into their robes, pressed against parents or siblings, warm and safe, and drift into deep sleep while the storm spent itself against the cone above them. The adults, more aware of the danger outside, might remain awake longer. They would listen, not with fear but with attention. They could tell from the sound and the feel of the structure whether everything was functioning properly. They could distinguish between normal flexing and problematic stress. They knew when to be concerned and when to simply wait. And usually, there was nothing to be concerned about. The tipi had been built correctly, the materials were sound, the design was proven. The storm, no matter how violent, could not overcome the accumulated wisdom of the people who had perfected this shelter over thousands of years. Sometimes, in the worst storm, a stake might pull loose. The cover would flutter at that point, creating a different sound, a sharper flapping rather than the deep drum. If this happened, someone would need to venture out briefly to reset the stake. This was done quickly with minimal exposure, and the problem was resolved. But most storms required nothing. The family would simply remain inside, warm and dry, listening to the rhythm until the storm passed. And eventually, it always passed. The wind would begin to ease, the drumming would slow, then fade. The violence would transition to a steady blow, then to gusts, then to calm. The storm would move on, travelling east across the prairie, leaving the tipi standing exactly as it had been before. When the storm ended, there was a particular quality to the air, a stillness, almost eerie after the hours of constant wind. The sudden quiet was as noticeable as the storm had been loud. Inside the tipi, the family would begin to stir. The fire, reduced to coals during the night, would be built back up. Small sticks would be added, then larger pieces, until flames rose again and warmth filled the space. The smoke would climb toward the flaps, which might need readjustment now that the wind had changed or stopped. The entrance flap would be untied and opened cautiously. Cold air would rush in, sharp and fresh. Someone would step outside, ducking through the low opening, emerging into the morning. The world outside would be transformed. If the storm had brought snow, everything would be covered. Fresh, clean drifts would reshape the landscape. The tipi itself would be partially buried at its base, snow piled against the windward side, creating even more insulation. If the storm had been rain or hail, the ground would be scoured, the grass flattened, water standing in low spots. The air would smell clean, washed, empty of dust, but the tipi would be standing, exactly as it had been before the storm. This was the moment of confirmation, the visual proof that the shelter had done its work. A walk around the perimeter would reveal minor adjustments needed. A stake here or there might need to be driven deeper. Snow might need to be cleared from the base to prevent moisture from seeping under the liner when it melted. The smoke flaps would be repositioned for the day's weather, but there would be no damage, no torn cover, no broken poles, no catastrophic failure. The tipi, designed for this moment, had withstood what it was built to withstand. The contrast with what might have happened to a different structure was stark. Modern observers, seeing the aftermath of severe storms on the plains, see destroyed buildings, roofs torn off, walls collapsed, debris scattered for miles, but the tipi, working with the wind rather than against it, remained intact. This reliability was essential for survival. If a shelter failed during a winter storm, the consequences were immediate and severe. Exposure to wind and cold in the aftermath of a structure collapse would be life-threatening. But the tipi did not fail. It could be trusted absolutely. After the inspection, life would resume its normal rhythm. If the storm had been brief, hunting or travel might continue that day. If it had been prolonged, food stores would be checked, and plans would be made based on supplies and conditions. The experience of weathering the storm would be absorbed into memory. Children would remember that the tipi held. Adults would have their confidence reinforced. The knowledge that had built this shelter would be proven once again, passed forward to the next generation not as theory, but as lived experience. And if another storm came, tomorrow, next week, next month, the family would face it with the same calm assurance. They would secure their home, adjust the flaps, tend the fire, and settle in to wait. The drumming would begin, and they would rest, safe in the knowledge that the cone of poles and hide would stand against whatever the sky delivered. The tipi was not an isolated invention. It was part of a complete way of life, shaped by and shaping the culture of the plains peoples. To understand the tipi fully, we must understand the lives of those who created it. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Crow, the Comanche, these and other nations made the Great Plains their home. Their lives were mobile, following the seasonal movements of the buffalo herds that provided nearly everything they needed. The buffalo was central to existence. It provided meat for food, bones for tools, sinew for thread and bowstrings, horns for containers, hooves for glue, organs for pouches and containers, and hide for clothing, shields, and shelter. The tipi itself was wrapped in the buffalo's skin. To live in a tipi was to live inside the gift of the buffalo. This relationship was not merely practical, it was spiritual. The buffalo was honoured, respected, treated not as a resource to be exploited, but as a relative to be thanked. Ceremonies surrounded the hunt. Prayers acknowledged the animal's sacrifice. Nothing was wasted. The mobility required by following the herds shaped every aspect of material culture. Everything had to be portable. Everything had to be designed to be packed, carried, and unpacked repeatedly. The tipi embodied this requirement perfectly. A family's tipi could be dismantled in less than an hour. The cover would be unlaced, folded, and packed. The poles would be bundled. Everything would be loaded onto travois, A-frame sleds, dragged by dogs or later horses. The family would move to the next camp following the herd, and the tipi would be erected again in the new location. This mobility meant that permanent structures were not possible. But it also meant that the tipi had to be perfected. It had to work reliably in every location, on any terrain, in any weather. There was no room for error, no backup shelter to fall back on if the tipi failed. The tipi also reflected social organisation. Each family owned their lodge. The women of the family owned it specifically, in many traditions. They built it, maintained it, decided when to move it, and passed it down through the female line. This ownership gave women significant status and authority. The size of a tipi reflected the family's wealth and status. A large tipi, requiring many hides and long poles, demonstrated success in hunting and the ability to process large amounts of material. It showed that the family was prosperous, capable, respected. The decoration of the tipi's exterior and interior also reflected status and identity. Geometric patterns, painted or quilled onto the cover, identified the family. Symbols of personal achievements, spiritual visions, or clan affiliations adorned the hide. The tipi became a statement of identity, visible across the camp. Camp organisation followed patterns. Tipis were arranged in circles or semicircles, with openings facing the same direction, usually east. This arrangement created communal space in the centre for gatherings, ceremonies, and social activities. It also provided mutual protection and allowed for shared vigilance. Within this mobile society, the tipi was home, not a temporary shelter, but a true dwelling where family life unfolded. Children were born in tipis, elders died in them, marriages were celebrated, losses were mourned, stories were told, and wisdom was passed down, all within the cone of poles and hide. The tipi's design allowed for this domesticity despite the mobility. Inside was warm, dry, and relatively spacious. There was room for a family to live comfortably. The fire provided light for work and socializing. The arrangement of the interior created defined spaces for different activities. It was, in every sense, a home. This home had to withstand not just storms, but the entire range of plains weather. Summer heat, when the tipi's ventilation system kept it cool. Spring rains, which the tanned hide shed without leaking. Autumn winds, which the cone deflected. And winter's brutal cold and the 100-mile-per-hour winds that came with the worst storms. The tipi succeeded in all conditions because it was not designed for any single challenge. It was designed for the totality of life on the plains. Every feature served multiple purposes. Every material was used to its fullest potential. Every detail was refined over generations of practical use. As the day drew toward its close, as the light faded from the sky, or what passed for daylight during the shorter seasons, the tipi would transition into its evening state. This was a time of gathering, of family, of rest from the day's labours. The fire would be built up slightly, not to a roaring blaze, but to a level that provided good light and steady warmth for the evening hours. The flames would climb higher than during midday, creating dancing shadows on the inner liner, illuminating the painted designs and personal items arranged around the walls. Food would be prepared, perhaps a stew simmering in a container suspended over the fire, perhaps strips of dried meat warmed near the flames, perhaps pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat and berries, pounded together into a nutritious, storable food. The cooking process added warmth to the tipi, and the smells of food created a sense of comfort and anticipation. The family would gather on the platform, arranged around the fire. Adults would sit on backrests or directly on the robes. Children would settle near their parents. Tools and materials for evening work would be brought out. This was the time for maintenance and repair. Clothing would be inspected. Any tears or weak seams would be mended, using sinew thread and bone needles. The work was done with care, ensuring that garments would be fully functional for the next day. Weapons and tools would be examined. Knives would be sharpened using stones. Arrow shafts would be straightened by warming them near the fire and carefully bending them. Bowstrings would be checked for wear and replaced if necessary. Repair work done in the evening meant readiness for the next day's hunting or travel. The work was often communal. Older children would help with simpler tasks, learning skills they would need as adults. Stories would be told while hands stayed busy. Knowledge would be passed down in the form of instruction disguised as conversation. This was also the time for teaching. A father might show a son how to knap flint, striking flakes to create a sharp edge for a knife or arrowhead. A mother might guide a daughter through the process of sewing a seam that would be waterproof and strong. These lessons were hands-on, practical or immediate, but there was also time for stories. The oral tradition of the Plains peoples was rich and complex. Stories served multiple purposes: entertainment, education, cultural transmission, spiritual instruction. An elder might recount a tale of the creation, explaining how the world came to be, Or a hunter might describe a memorable hunt, the strategies used, the lessons learned. These stories were not mere entertainment. They contained essential information. A story about a particular animal might teach its behaviour patterns, useful for hunting. A tale about a journey might describe landmarks, water sources, and dangers. A myth about the stars might encode astronomical knowledge, helping with navigation and seasonal awareness. The telling was an art. A skilled storyteller would modulate their voice, creating drama, an emphasis. They might use gestures, acting out parts of the narrative. The fire's light would flicker across their face, adding to the atmosphere. Children would listen with rapt attention, absorbing not just the words but the cadence, the delivery, the art of storytelling itself. Laughter was common, humour was valued, and many stories contained elements of comedy or irony. The ability to find joy, even in difficult times, was seen as a strength. Laughter in the evening helped release the day's tensions and reinforced social bonds. As the evening progressed, the fire would be allowed to burn down slightly. The most intense work would be completed. The stories would wind toward their conclusions. The youngest children, tired from the day, would begin to drift towards sleep. Parents would prepare their children for bed, ensuring they were warm, comfortable, positioned safely on the platform. Robes would be arranged. Final checks would be made. The fire banked properly, the smoke flaps positioned correctly, the entrance secured. And gradually the teepee would quiet. The murmur of conversation would fade to whispers, then to silence. The fire would become coals, glowing softly, radiating gentle warmth without flame. The family would settle into their sleeping positions, wrapped in fur, surrounded by the familiar walls of their home. Outside, the wind might be rising again, or it might be calm. The stars might be visible through the smoke hole, or clouds might cover the sky. But inside, the teepee maintained its own environment. Warm, quiet, safe. A space carved out of the harsh plains landscape through knowledge, skill, and generations of refinement. The confidence with which a family settled into their tipi during a storm was not naive optimism. It was not hope or wishful thinking. It was certainty born from countless experiences, from knowledge tested and proven over thousands of years. Every element of the tipi's design had been refined through trial and error. When a technique didn't work, when a material failed, when a design proved inadequate, it was changed. The tipis that survived were the ones whose builders learned from mistakes, adapted, improved. This process of refinement took place across generations. A grandmother would teach her daughter the proper way to stake the cover, the correct tension to achieve. That daughter would teach her own daughter, perhaps adding a detail she had discovered, a slight improvement in technique. Over centuries, this accumulation of small improvements created a near-perfect design. The knowledge was also tested constantly. Every storm was a test. Every winter was a trial. Families that built their teepees correctly survived. Those who made mistakes, who cut corners, who ignored the accumulated wisdom faced consequences. The environment was unforgiving. It did not tolerate poor shelter design. This meant that by the time a child was born into a plains family, the tipi they lived in represented the distilled wisdom of perhaps 100 generations. Every stake, every pole, every seam, every adjustment of the smoke flaps, all of it was backed by centuries of refinement. The child would grow up inside this wisdom. They would see every day how the teepee worked. They would experience storms from inside its protection. They would learn gradually how to read the wind, how to adjust the flaps, how to build and maintain their own teepee when the time came. This education was not formal. There were no classrooms, no written instructions. The learning happened through observation, participation, and gradual responsibility. A young child might help carry light items when the tipi was moved. An older child might help with staking or pole arrangement. An adolescent might be trusted to adjust the smoke flaps or tend the fire. By adulthood, a person would have absorbed the complete knowledge system. They would know not just how to build a tipi, but why each element mattered. They would understand the principles: airflow, tension, flexibility, insulation. Even if they didn't use those specific words, they would have intuitive knowledge born from experience. This knowledge was practical, not theoretical. It was tested every day. And because it was tested constantly, people trusted it absolutely. When a storm approached, there was no anxiety about whether the shelter would hold. It would hold. It always had. It always would, as long as it was built correctly. This trust extended to sleep, to lie down, to close your eyes, to surrender consciousness while a violent storm attacks your home. This requires absolute faith. That faith existed because it was earned. The tipi had proven itself, not once, not occasionally, but repeatedly, reliably across generations. Modern people living in structures we did not build ourselves often lack this visceral trust. We hear wind and we worry, we see warnings and we prepare for possible evacuation. We maintain insurance because we know structures can fail, and they do fail, sometimes catastrophically. But the tipi, built by the family that lived in it, maintained by those who depended on it, refined over thousands of years, it did not fail. Not if built correctly, not if maintained properly. The trust was not blind, it was earned. The tipi was not a structure for winter alone. It was a year-round home, adapting to the full cycle of plains weather. Each season brought different challenges, and the tipi responded to all of them. In summer, when the sun blazed and temperatures climbed, the tipi became a cooling shelter. The cover would be raised at the bottom, lifting it several inches or even a foot off the ground. This created a gap all around the perimeter, allowing air to flow freely through the interior. The smoke hole at the top would be opened wide, creating a chimney effect. Hot air inside would rise and escape through the top, while cooler air from outside would be drawn in through the bottom gap. This natural ventilation kept the interior comfortable even during the hottest days. The inner liner, so critical for winter warmth, could be removed or rolled up during summer. This eliminated the insulating air gap and allowed maximum airflow. The tipi became an open, airy space, shaded from the sun but well ventilated. In spring and autumn, the tipi handled rain with ease. The tanned buffalo hide or canvas cover was water-resistant. Rain would strike the sloping surface and run down, dripping off the edges away from the base. The seams, stitched with sinew that swelled when wet, became watertight. Inside remained dry. The tipi's conical shape also shed snow efficiently. Snow that accumulated on the cover would slide down the steep slopes, preventing dangerous build-up that could add weight and stress the structure. The smooth, curved surface gave the snow nothing to cling to. Throughout the year, the tipi could be adjusted. The cover could be raised or lowered, the liner could be installed or removed. The smoke flaps could be positioned for any wind direction or weather condition. This adaptability meant the tipi remained comfortable and functional regardless of the season. The annual cycle of movement followed the seasons as well. In summer, camps might be larger, with multiple families gathering for communal hunts and ceremonies. In winter, camps were often smaller, positioned in sheltered valleys or river bottoms where wind was less severe and firewood more available. But wherever the camp, whatever the season, the tipi remained the constant centre of family life. It was home, unchanged in its essential form, adapted in its details to meet each season's demands. This adaptability was another mark of the design's sophistication. A structure that only worked in one season, in one type of weather, would have been inadequate for plains life. The tipi worked in all conditions because it was designed with the full range of possibilities in mind. The people who created it lived through every season, every type of storm, every extreme of temperature. They knew what summer heat felt like, what winter cold demanded, what spring rain and autumn wind could do. And they created a shelter that answered all of these challenges with a single, elegant design. The tipi represents more than engineering. It represents a way of understanding the world, a relationship with the environment that was based on observation, respect, and adaptation. The people who perfected the tipi did not have written records. They did not have blueprints or engineering textbooks. What they had was attention. They watched how wind moved across the land. They studied how animals sheltered from storms. They tested materials and methods, keeping what worked and discarding what didn't. This knowledge was preserved through practice. Every time a tipi was built, the knowledge was enacted. Every time a child watched their parents stake the cover or adjust the flaps, the knowledge was transmitted. The tipi itself was the textbook, the curriculum, the lesson plan. The knowledge was also preserved in language. Many plains languages had specific words for different types of snow, different wind conditions, different aspects of tipi construction and maintenance. These words encoded observations and distinctions that were critical for survival. Stories, as mentioned earlier, carried knowledge as well. A story about a family that survived a terrible storm might contain details about how they positioned their tipi, how they secured it, what they did during the crisis. Future generations would remember the story and apply its lessons. This oral and practical transmission of knowledge proved remarkably effective. The tipi design remained essentially unchanged for centuries because it worked. There was no need for radical innovation when the existing design met all requirements. However, the knowledge was also vulnerable. It depended on continuity, on each generation learning from the previous one. When that continuity was disrupted through forced relocations, cultural suppression, or the decimation of the buffalo herds, the knowledge began to fade. By the late 19th century, the way of life that had created and sustained the tipi was under assault. The buffalo were hunted to near extinction, deliberately, as a way to force plains peoples onto reservations. Without buffalo, the traditional tipi cover became impossible to make. Canvas substituted, but the relationship with the animal was broken. Forced settlement ended the mobile life. Children were taken to boarding schools where traditional knowledge was forbidden. The languages that carried the specific vocabulary of tipi construction were suppressed. The continuity was shattered, but the knowledge did not disappear entirely. Some families maintained it. Some elders kept the old ways alive, teaching those who would listen. And in recent generations there has been a revival. People have returned to the tipi, reconstructing the knowledge, relearning the skills. Modern tipis are built today by those who recognize the value of this ancestral wisdom. The designs are studied, documented, shared. The principles are explained in new languages, using modern terms, but the core understanding remains the same. The tipi stands as testament to what human beings can achieve through patient observation and gradual refinement. It represents a depth of environmental knowledge that took thousands of years to accumulate. It shows what is possible when a culture lives in close relationship with a landscape, adapting to it rather than trying to dominate it. Today, the tipi endures, not as a relic, not as a museum piece, but as a living structure still used, still valued, still teaching its lessons. On reservations and in traditional communities, tipis are erected for ceremonies, gatherings, and sometimes for living. They connect the present to the past, maintaining cultural continuity in a changed world. Outside indigenous communities, the tipi has been adopted and adapted by others. Campers and outdoor enthusiasts recognize its practicality. The design has influenced modern tent engineering. The principles, aerodynamic shape, flexible structure, controlled ventilation, appear in contemporary outdoor shelter design. But the tipi also offers lessons that extend beyond camping. It demonstrates sustainable design, using renewable materials efficiently. It shows adaptive architecture, responding to different conditions with the same basic structure. It exemplifies resilience, not through rigid resistance, but through flexible accommodation. In an era of climate change, of increasingly severe weather, of the need for sustainable living, the tipi offers a model. It shows that human shelter can work with natural forces rather than simply trying to overpower them. It demonstrates that less can be more, that a simple, well-designed structure can outperform a complex, resource-intensive one. The tipi also reminds us that indigenous knowledge systems contain deep wisdom. For too long, such knowledge was dismissed as primitive or outdated. But the tipi proves otherwise. It is sophisticated engineering, refined over millennia, solving problems that modern designers still struggle with. Engineers studying the tipi have found principles that inform contemporary design. The aerodynamics of the cone shape, the use of flexible materials to absorb stress, the creation of air gaps for insulation, all of these have parallels in modern architecture and engineering. But the tipi's lessons extend beyond the technical. It teaches about the relationship between humans and the environment. It shows what becomes possible when people observe, learn patiently, and refine continuously over generations. It demonstrates the value of traditional knowledge and the importance of preserving it. For those who sleep in a tipi today, the experience connects them to something ancient and profound. The sound of wind on taut canvas, the warmth of a small fire, the feeling of being held safely within a cone of simple materials. These are the same experiences that countless generations knew. That continuity matters. It reminds us that we are not the first people to face harsh conditions, to need shelter, to create solutions. It connects us to the long human story of adaptation and survival. It humbles us and inspires us at the same time. For the children of the plains, the sound of wind on the tipi was their first lullaby. Before they could walk, before they could speak, They heard that deep drumming and knew they were safe. As infants, they were wrapped in soft furs, held close to their mothers, surrounded by the warmth of family. The sound of the wind was part of their earliest memories, woven into their understanding of what home meant. As they grew, they learned what the sound signified. They learned to distinguish between the steady drum of normal wind and the more intense vibration of a storm. They learned to sleep through weather that would terrify someone unfamiliar with the shelter. This was not taught through explicit instruction. It was absorbed, the way language is absorbed, through constant exposure and experience. The sound became part of their internal landscape, a marker of safety and belonging. When these children became adults and built their own tipis, when they had children of their own, that sound would continue. Generation after generation, the same drumming, the same reassurance, the same message. You're protected, you're home, you're safe. This continuity of experience is rare in human history. Most people have seen their shelters change dramatically over generations, but the tipi remained essentially unchanged for centuries. A great-great-grandmother's experience of sleeping in a tipi during a storm would have been nearly identical to her great-great-granddaughter's experience generations later. This stability of experience created a deep sense of continuity and identity. The tipi was not just a shelter, it was a connection to ancestors, a link in an unbroken chain of knowledge and survival. The sound of the wind on the tipi was the sound of that connection. It was the ancestors speaking through the design they had perfected. It was the land itself, acknowledged and respected rather than fought against. It was the buffalo, still present in the hide that formed the walls. It was all of these things, held together in that steady rhythmic drumming. For those who knew it, the sound meant they were part of something larger than themselves. They were part of a people who had learned to thrive in a challenging landscape. They were inheritors of knowledge that had been tested and proven over thousands of years. They were home. Dawn would come eventually, as it always did. The storm would pass, as it always passed. And the tipi would be standing, as it always stood. The family would wake slowly, reluctant to leave the warmth of their robes. The fire would have burned down to coals during the night, and the first task would be to rebuild it. Small kindling would be added, coaxed into iron flame, and gradually built back to a steady burn. The smoke would rise toward the flaps, which might need adjustment for the morning's wind direction. Someone would step outside briefly to check conditions and reposition the control poles if necessary. The entrance flap would be opened, letting in fresh air and whatever light the day offered. Cold would rush in for a moment, then the flap would be closed again while the fire built warmth. Gradually, the family would emerge from sleep, stretching, moving stiff limbs, adjusting to wakefulness. The children would be roused gently, the elders would rise at their own pace, everyone would prepare for the day's activities. Food would be prepared, perhaps a simple meal warmed near the fire, perhaps water melted from snow or ice heated for drinking. The morning meal was functional, providing energy for whatever the day required. Outside, the world would be exactly as the tipi had promised. The storm would have left its marks. Snow drifted, the landscape reshaped, the air clear and cold. But the tipi would be unchanged. A few pegs might need attention. Snow might need to be cleared from the base, but nothing would be broken, nothing would have failed. This was the proof, repeated every time a storm passed. The tipi worked, the design was sound, the knowledge was true, the family was safe, and so the day would begin, another cycle in the endless rhythm of life on the plains. The tipi, having sheltered them through the night, would continue to be their home. The knowledge that built it would be reinforced, proven once again, ready to be passed to the next generation. The wind might rise again tomorrow or next week or next month. But when it did, the family would be ready. They would secure their tipi, adjust the flaps, tend the fire, and settle into wait. The drumming would begin, that familiar sound, and they would rest. Not with fear, but with the faith. Not with anxiety, but with certainty. The tipi would hold, it always had, it always would, and in that knowledge they would find peace. They would find sleep, they would find home. The story of the tipi is a story of patience, observation, and profound respect for the natural world. It is a story of people who did not try to dominate their environment but learned to live within it, adapting their shelter to work with forces that could not be resisted. The tipi stands as a testament to indigenous ingenuity. It shows what becomes possible when knowledge is accumulated across generations, when each improvement is tested by survival itself, when the relationship between people and place is built on attention and respect. For those who slept in tipis during 100-mile-per-hour winds, the experience was not one of terror but of profound security. The sound of the wind on taut hide was not a warning of danger but a confirmation of safety. The slight movement of the poles was not a sign of weakness but a demonstration of strength through flexibility. This shelter, made from poles and hide secured with wooden stakes, managed by adjustable flaps, insulated by trapped air and buffalo fur, this simple structure provided protection that many modern buildings cannot match. It did so not through brute force or massive materials, but through intelligent design refined over millennia. The tipi reminds us that the wisest solutions are often the simplest, that working with nature rather than against it produces the most resilient results. That traditional knowledge, accumulated through generations of lived experience, contains insights that remain valuable even in our technologically advanced age. As you rest now, as your breathing slows and your thoughts quiet, consider the countless nights when families lay wrapped in buffalo robes, listening to the storm drum its rhythm on their shelter, and slept in perfect peace. Consider the knowledge that made that peace possible. Consider the wisdom of yielding rather than resisting, of flexibility rather than rigidity, of adaptation rather than domination. The wind still blows across the Great Plains. The storms still come, and in some places, tipis still stand against them, holding fast just as they always have. May you rest as peacefully as those families did, held safe by the accumulated wisdom of generations, cradled in the certainty that good design, patient refinement, and deep knowledge can create shelter even in the harshest conditions. Sleep well. The wind cannot touch you here. The storm will pass, and morning will come unchanged and whole.